Emily Turner tightened her grip on the steering wheel as she wound her way through the narrow country road, the trees arching over her car like skeletal fingers. Hollowbrook was further from the city than she remembered, a place buried in maps most people no longer cared to find. The tires crunched over loose gravel as her GPS flickered, losing and regaining signal in quick succession, its monotone voice guiding her deeper into the heart of nowhere. It was exactly what she wanted. The road stretched ahead, lined with mist that clung to the trees like a veil. Emily's chest tightened slightly as she reminded herself this move was necessary. A fresh start. The city had been suffocating, full of memories and tension, the noise of it all ringing constantly in her ears. Here, in this forgotten corner of the world, she hoped to drown the noise out. Silence. That's what she needed now. The town of Hollowbrook came into view, barely more than a scattering of weathered buildings and forgotten streets. A single gas station, a diner whose neon sign flickered weakly in the early evening light. A general store that seemed as old as the town itself. As Emily drove through, heads turned slowly to watch, their expressions unreadable. She could feel their eyes on her through the car windows, curiosity tinged with something she couldn't quite name. She passed through the town in under 5 minutes, the houses thinning out and giving way to the dense woods again. The GPS blipped once more, signaling her arrival. There, she whispered to herself, pulling up to the house she would now call home. The house was tucked away at the edge of the forest, its weather-beaten exterior standing alone in the fading light. 2 stories, small porch, tall windows. The overgrown grass rustled in the breeze, brushing against the sides of the house as if whispering secrets long forgotten. It wasn't much, but it had potential. Potential was what she needed right now. Emily parked the car and stepped out, her boots sinking into the soft, wet earth. The air here was different, crisper, cooler than she expected for late autumn. There was a stillness in the air that reminded her of the moments just before a storm, where the world holds its breath. She shook off the feeling and grabbed her bags from the trunk. The key slid easily into the lock, and the door creaked open with a low groan, as if the house was waking up after a long sleep. Inside, it smelled of dust and old wood. The realtor had said the previous owners left in a hurry. "Family emergency," she had explained without elaboration. Emily didn't ask questions. She preferred it that way. There were enough ghosts in her own past without having to worry about someone else's. As she stepped into the house, the floorboards creaked underfoot, a hollow sound that echoed up into the high ceilings. She dropped her bags in the foyer and took a deep breath. It was quiet, almost too quiet, the kind of silence that pressed in around you, leaving no room for distractions or escapes. It felt strange, unsettling even, but she attributed it to the change in atmosphere. The house just needed time to feel like home. After unpacking a few essentials, Emily wandered from room to room, familiarizing herself with the layout. The kitchen was simple, functional. A large window looked out over the woods, where shadows stretched long and dark beneath the trees. There was a fireplace in the living room, stone and brick, cold now but promising warmth. The upstairs bedroom had a wide window that faced the edge of the forest, its panes streaked with grime. She'd need to clean that. As she climbed back down the stairs, her foot caught a loose board, and she stumbled. "That's going to be annoying," she muttered, making a mental note to fix it. The sun had dipped below the horizon by the time Emily made herself a cup of tea and settled into the worn armchair in the living room. The house creaked as it cooled, old wood shifting in the night. She reminded herself that older houses did that. It was nothing to worry about. But despite her best efforts to relax, an edge of unease clung to her thoughts. Her eyes drifted to the window. The woods were almost impenetrable in the dark, the thick canopy of trees blurring into a black void. For a moment, she thought she saw something move just beyond the tree line, a flicker of motion. A figure? She blinked, and it was gone. Just the wind, she told herself, brushing through the trees. She was still getting used to this new setting. The first night in a new place was always the hardest. Emily yawned and rubbed her eyes. Maybe sleep would help. The first sound woke her from a shallow sleep, a soft thump outside her window. Emily sat up in bed, straining to listen. The house was still, but there it was again, a muffled, deliberate sound, like footsteps moving across the ground just beneath her window. She glanced at the clock, 2:13 a.m. The darkness outside felt heavier now, oppressive in a way she hadn't noticed before. The footsteps were faint but steady, pacing back and forth outside. She slipped out of bed and crossed to the window, peering through the dirty glass. Nothing. Only the dark trees swaying slightly in the breeze. Her heart pounded in her chest, the quiet suddenly too loud. She pressed her ear to the glass. For a moment, the silence returned, and then, just barely audible, came the softest sound of whispering. She couldn't make out the words, if they were words at all, but the cadence was there, a hushed conversation carried by the wind. Emily stepped back, her skin prickling. She told herself it was just her imagination, the remnants of an uneasy dream. But sleep didn't come easily after that. The sound of footsteps echoed in her mind long after the night had grown still again. Tomorrow, she thought, she'd explore the woods, see if there was anything out there. But as she lay awake in the dark, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The footsteps were louder last night. Emily had counted every step, each one pacing beneath her window, slow and deliberate, a heavy rhythm that refused to fade even after hours passed. She'd forced herself to stay in bed, telling herself it was the wind, a stray animal, anything that made sense. But nothing had. The first light of morning did little to ease her nerves. She stood at the kitchen window, staring out into the woods. The trees loomed tall, their branches like jagged bones silhouetted against the overcast sky. The forest seemed thicker today, as if the shadows between the trunks were growing darker, reaching deeper. She couldn't help but feel that something was out there, watching, waiting. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe she was overreacting. She was alone out here, after all, and that kind of isolation could play tricks on the mind. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Her phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was a text from Rachel, her best friend back in the city. Emily had told her about the move to Hollowbrook weeks ago, but she hadn't mentioned the strange noises. She wasn't ready to be dismissed as paranoid. Instead, she read Rachel's cheerful message about weekend plans in the city, then turned off the phone, feeling a pang of envy for how far removed she now felt from her old life. The woods called to her again. It was irrational, she knew, to think that wandering into them would make anything better. But she had to see for herself, had to know if there was something there or if her mind was fabricating all of it. Emily pulled on her boots and grabbed a jacket, hesitating briefly at the door before stepping outside. The wind carried a damp chill, and the scent of earth and pine filled the air. The trees stood like sentinels at the edge of her property, their towering forms stretching into a gray sky. With slow steps, she crossed the yard and stepped into the woods. The deeper she walked into the forest, the more the world seemed to shift around her. The trees here grew so close together that their branches tangled above her head, forming a canopy that blocked out most of the light. The air felt thicker, and every step she took was accompanied by the soft crunch of leaves underfoot. Though it wasn't her footsteps that concerned her, it was the other ones. They were still there, faint but unmistakable, an echo in the distance, like someone walking parallel to her. They would stop whenever she paused, only to resume when she moved again. It was as though she was caught in a loop, following and being followed by a presence she could never quite catch up to. A low breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it a familiar sound, the whispering. The cadence was the same as last night, the hushed, unintelligible murmur that raised the fine hairs on her arms. Emily spun around, searching for the source, but there was nothing. The forest stood still, but the whispers continued, threading through the air like a soft melody just out of reach. A knot tightened in her stomach. This was wrong. She shouldn't be out here, not alone. But just as she was about to turn back, something caught her eye. A clearing. The trees parted ahead of her, revealing an open space bathed in shadow. In the center of the clearing stood an old, weathered cabin, its roof sagging and the windows dark. Emily hesitated on the edge of the clearing, unsure whether to approach. The cabin looked abandoned, but something about it sent a chill down her spine. The footsteps, they had stopped. The whispering, too. The silence that now enveloped her was worse, a hollow emptiness that pressed in from all sides. Emily swallowed hard, her pulse quickening as she took a step toward the cabin. The cabin door was slightly ajar, creaking as she pushed it open with one hand. Inside, the smell of mildew and decay hit her instantly. The room was small, the floor covered in dirt and leaves that had blown in over time. Dust motes danced in the dim light filtering through the cracks in the walls. On one side of the room, a small table sat crookedly, its surface covered in what looked like old photographs. She moved closer, her heart pounding. The photographs were aged, their edges curling and yellowing with time. They depicted people, families, couples, children, but all the faces had been scratched out. In every photo, the figures stood in front of the same cabin. This cabin. Emily's breath caught as she lifted one of the photos. The faces were violently marred, deep scratches where eyes and mouths should have been. The feeling of being watched suddenly overwhelmed her, but when she spun around, the cabin was empty. Her eyes fell on something else, a small leather-bound book sitting beneath the table, half buried under the debris. She knelt down, dusting it off before carefully opening it. The pages were brittle, the ink faded, but it was a journal. The entries were brief, scattered across the pages, written in hurried, frantic handwriting. The footsteps again last night. Can't sleep. They're getting closer. I saw something in the woods. He's watching. Always watching. Emily's fingers trembled as she flipped through the pages. The entries became more desperate, more fragmented. The writer, Margaret, if the name scrawled on the inside cover was correct, had lived here, alone, until she disappeared. The last entry was short, but it made Emily's blood run cold. He will come for me soon. He always does. I can hear his footsteps. The journal slipped from Emily's hands and she stood abruptly. The air in the cabin felt oppressive, pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She turned to leave, but as she stepped toward the door, something outside caught her eye. A figure, standing just beyond the tree line, watching her. She froze, her mind racing. The figure was indistinct, blurred, as if the shadows themselves had taken form. For a moment, neither of them moved. Emily's breath hitched in her throat, her pulse thundering in her ears. And then the figure stepped back into the darkness of the trees, vanishing without a sound. The footsteps returned, louder this time, echoing through the clearing as though multiple people were circling her. Emily bolted from the cabin, her heart pounding, her feet crunching against the leaves as she ran. The woods closed in around her, branches snagging at her jacket, slowing her down. The footsteps followed, relentless, their rhythm matching her own. When she finally burst out of the woods and into the yard of her house, her chest heaving and her throat raw, she stopped. The air was still, her surroundings calm, as though nothing had happened. The footsteps, too, had ceased. Emily leaned against the side of the house, trying to steady her breathing. She glanced back toward the trees. The figure was gone. Only the whispers remained, faint and distant, carried on the wind. She slammed the door behind her, locking it with trembling hands. The safety of her home felt fragile, like a thin wall between her and something much darker, much older. She hadn't imagined it. The figure had been real. The footsteps, real. Whatever was out there, it had noticed her, and now it was closer than ever. Emily hadn't left the house in days. Not since the figure in the woods, not since the footsteps began following her even during the day. The darkness inside her home felt safer than the woods outside, though only marginally. Sleep came in brief, broken intervals, and when it did, the dreams were vivid and haunting. Shadows slipping through the trees, eyes watching from the edges of her vision, always just out of sight. She had thought the isolation of Hollowbrook would be comforting, but now it felt suffocating. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was heavy, pressing in from every direction, threatening to consume her. The only break in the silence was the sound of those incessant footsteps, always on the edge of her hearing, like a constant, chilling reminder that she was no longer alone. Sitting at the kitchen table, Emily stared at the journal she'd found in the cabin, the name scrawled on the inside cover. Margaret. It had been haunting her since the day she discovered it. Margaret had lived in that cabin, and the journal was her desperate record of the sounds, the figure, the footsteps. It was as though she had been documenting Emily's own experience decades before it even began. She needed answers, and the only place she could think of finding them was the Hollowbrook Library. The Hollowbrook Library was small, tucked away on a side street behind the general store. Inside, the space smelled of old paper and dust, the shelves sagging with books that hadn't been touched in years. There was only one other person there, a man sitting behind the front desk, his thinning hair pulled back into a messy ponytail. He looked up as she entered, offering a nod that seemed both welcoming and wary. Owen, she remembered. The librarian. She had seen him briefly when she first moved in, though they hadn't exchanged more than a few words. Emily hesitated for a moment, unsure of how much to reveal. She wasn't ready to sound insane. But then again, the things happening in Hollowbrook couldn't be brushed off as rational. "Excuse me," she began, approaching the desk. "I was wondering if you had any information on the history of this town, or the old houses around here, particularly the one on the outskirts, near the woods." Owen looked up from the book he had been reading. His expression shifted slightly, his brow furrowing as if he was trying to place her. "The one by the woods?" he asked slowly. "The house you moved into?" "Yes," Emily swallowed. "I've been hearing things, strange things, footsteps at night, voices, and I found this." She placed Margaret's journal on the desk, watching as Owen's face paled slightly. He reached out to touch the book, but then stopped, his hand hovering just above it, as though afraid it might burn him. "I was hoping you could tell me something," she continued. "Anything about the house? About what's happening to me? Please." Owen's gaze flicked from the journal to Emily, his eyes dark with concern. He closed his own book and leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You're not the first," he said. The word sent a chill down her spine. "What do you mean?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Owen stood, walking around the desk and motioning for her to follow him deeper into the library. He led her to a back room cluttered with boxes and old records, the air thick with dust. He rummaged through one of the boxes before pulling out a file marked *Local Legends*. "You won't find much about it in official history books," he said, flipping through yellowed pages of notes and clippings. "But this town has always had stories, especially about that house." Emily listened intently, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. Owen continued, pulling out an old newspaper clipping with a faded photograph of the house. Her house. The headline was barely legible: "Family vanishes without a trace." "The people who lived in that house," Owen explained, pointing to the article. "They all claimed to hear footsteps, whispers, same as you. And then they disappeared. No one ever found them." Emily stared at the article, her heart racing. How many people? Over the years, 4 families, maybe more, all gone. The locals believe it's tied to the woods. They say the forest out there is cursed. The word hung in the air, heavy with ancient dread. "Some say it's the Watcher," Owen continued, his voice dropping lower. "An old legend, something most people in town try to ignore. They say it's an entity, something that lives in the woods, something that follows people who come here with a certain vulnerability. It preys on them, feeding on their fear, their guilt. And once it has its grip on you..." He trailed off, his eyes locking with hers. "Once it has its grip on you, it doesn't let go." Emily's mouth went dry. "The footsteps. That's the Watcher?" Owen nodded grimly. "At least that's what the legends say. It starts with footsteps. It always starts that way. Then the voices. Then people vanish." Emily felt her stomach twist into knots. "What about Margaret?" she asked, gesturing to the journal. "She mentioned the same things. Did she..." "She lived alone in that cabin for years," Owen said, glancing at the journal. "People say she was driven mad by the Watcher. Eventually, she stopped coming into town. No one's seen her since." Emily's hands trembled as she closed the journal. The weight of everything Owen had just told her was suffocating. She had come here for peace, for escape, but now it seemed as though the house, and something far older, had been waiting for her all along. "I can't stay there," she said suddenly, her voice shaking. "I can't..." Owen shook his head, his expression filled with sympathy. "It's not that simple. People who try to leave, something keeps them here. A car that won't start, an accident, a sudden storm. It's almost like it wants you to stay." Emily's breath quickened. The thought of leaving had crossed her mind more than once in the last few days, but each time something had stopped her. The car wouldn't start, or she'd feel a strange compulsion to stay, as if her will wasn't her own. "What am I supposed to do?" she asked, her voice a quiet plea. Owen hesitated. "There's one more thing. Some believe that the Watcher doesn't just feed on fear. It also feeds on unresolved guilt. People who come here, there's always something dark in their past, something they're running from." Emily's stomach turned over at his words, and her mind flashed back to the memories she had spent so long burying. The accident, the guilt she had carried for so long. Had the Watcher been drawn to that, to her? "I don't know if you can escape it," Owen admitted, "but you have to confront it. Whatever it is you're hiding from, it knows. And that's what it's using to keep you here." Emily left the library feeling even more trapped than before. As she stepped out into the cold air, the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it a familiar, distant sound. Footsteps, faint, steady, always following. Back at the house, Emily sat in the darkened living room, her mind racing. Everything Owen had said only confirmed what she had already feared. Something was after her. Something old and patient, and it had no intention of letting her go. The footsteps grew louder as night fell, pacing outside her window, closer now than ever before. Whatever the watcher was, it had its grip on her, and Emily had no idea how to break free. The wind howled through the trees as the night swallowed Hollowbrook whole. Inside the house, Emily sat motionless in the living room, the fire flickering weakly, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. Her heart raced, pounding louder than the wind outside, louder than the footsteps that had now become a constant presence around her. They circled the house, moving closer, growing bolder with each passing hour. She knew it was coming. She had tried everything. She had packed her bags, tried to flee, but the car had sputtered and died at the edge of town, as if some unseen force had pulled the life from it. She had tried calling for help, but her phone refused to hold a signal. And now, as the clock ticked past midnight, she realized there was no running, no escape. The Watcher was here. For days, she had felt its gaze, a cold weight pressing on her every move, lurking just beyond her vision. It wasn't just in the woods anymore. It was inside the house, inside her mind, digging up everything she had buried, the guilt, the fear, the unspeakable truth she had carried with her ever since that night. The night of the accident. Emily closed her eyes, trying to suppress the memory, but it rushed in like floodwater. The screech of tires, the wet thud, the deafening silence that followed as she stumbled out of the car, her hands shaking, her vision blurred. Rachel, her best friend, crumpled on the pavement. Emily had been the one driving. She had been the one who looked away for just a moment. The guilt had consumed her, but she had shoved it down, locked it away, never letting it fully surface. Until now. Until the Watcher brought it back. She opened her eyes and the room seemed darker than before. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was worse, thick, suffocating, unnatural. It pressed against her skin like cold hands. And then she heard it. A voice. A whisper, faint at first, but growing louder. It was coming from the woods. Come. Her throat tightened as she stood up, her legs trembling beneath her. The whisper wasn't just a sound. It was a pull, drawing her toward it, deeper into the darkness. She knew what it wanted, knew where it wanted her to go. The woods. The fire in the hearth flickered and died as she grabbed her jacket and opened the door. The cold air slapped her in the face, but she barely felt it. Her eyes were fixed on the tree line, where the shadows twisted and swayed in the wind. The whisper was stronger now, curling around her like a soft caress, pushing her forward. The trees seemed to pulse with life, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, waiting to close around her. Emily stepped into the woods. The darkness here was complete. The faint glow of the moon was lost behind thick clouds, leaving only shadows to guide her. The whisper became a chorus, voices intertwining and pulling her deeper into the forest, toward the heart of it all. The footsteps began again, echoing through the trees. They were faster now, urgent, almost frantic. Emily stumbled, her breath coming in ragged gasps, but she kept moving. The ground was uneven beneath her, roots snaking out to trip her, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. As she reached the clearing, her heart nearly stopped. The cabin stood before her, its windows black, the roof sagging even further as if the weight of time had crushed it. But this time, it wasn't empty. There, in the center of the clearing, stood the Watcher. It was not a man nor a spirit. It was a shadow, a shape that flickered and twisted, always just on the edge of form, its eyes like two burning coals in the darkness. It stood still, waiting, watching. Emily's chest tightened as she faced it. The wind howled around her, and yet the air inside the clearing was deathly still. Her legs shook, but she forced herself to take a step forward, then another. The Watcher didn't move, but she felt its presence bearing down on her, as if it were peeling back the layers of her mind, stripping away her defenses, her fear, her guilt. It was all there, exposed, raw, and bleeding. The whispers grew louder. Face it. She collapsed to her knees in the center of the clearing, her hands digging into the cold, damp earth. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her body trembling uncontrollably. The memory of that night, the night she killed Rachel, played over and over in her mind, sharper now, more vivid than it had ever been. She could still see her best friend's face, the horror in her eyes just before the impact. She had killed her, and she had tried to forget. But the Watcher didn't let her forget. Tears streamed down Emily's face as she looked up at the shadow looming over her. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I'm sorry." The night of the accident, Emily closed her eyes, trying to suppress the memory, but it rushed in like floodwater. The screech of tires, the wet thud, the deafening silence that followed as she stumbled out of the car, her hands shaking, her vision blurred. Rachel, her best friend, crumpled on the pavement. Emily had been the one driving. She had been the one who looked away for just a moment. The guilt had consumed her, but she had shoved it down, locked it away, never letting it fully surface, until now, until the Watcher brought it back. She opened her eyes and the room seemed darker than before. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was worse, thick, suffocating, unnatural. It pressed against her skin like cold hands. And then she heard it, a voice, a whisper, faint at first, but growing louder. It was coming from the woods. "Come." Her throat tightened as she stood up, her legs trembling beneath her. The whisper wasn't just a sound, it was a pull, drawing her toward it, deeper into the darkness. She knew what it wanted, knew where it wanted her to go. The woods. The fire in the hearth flickered and died as she grabbed her jacket and opened the door. The cold air slapped her in the face, but she barely felt it. Her eyes were fixed on the tree line, where the shadows twisted and swayed in the wind. The whisper was stronger now, curling around her like a soft caress, pushing her forward. The trees seemed to pulse with life, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, waiting to close around her. Emily stepped into the woods. The darkness here was complete. The faint glow of the moon was lost behind thick clouds, leaving only shadows to guide her. The whisper became a chorus, voices intertwining and pulling her deeper into the forest, toward the heart of it all. The footsteps began again, echoing through the trees. They were faster now, urgent, almost frantic. Emily stumbled, her breath coming in ragged gasps, but she kept moving. The ground was uneven beneath her, roots snaking out to trip her, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. As she reached the clearing, her heart nearly stopped. The cabin stood before her, its windows black, the roof sagging even further as if the weight of time had crushed it. But this time it wasn't empty. There, in the center of the clearing, stood the Watcher. It was not a man, nor a spirit. It was a shadow, a shape that flickered and twisted, always just on the edge of form, its eyes like two burning coals in the darkness. It stood still, waiting, watching. Emily's chest tightened as she faced it. The wind howled around her, and yet the air inside the clearing was deathly still. Her legs shook, but she forced herself to take a step forward, then another. The Watcher didn't move, but she felt its presence bearing down on her, as if it were peeling back the layers of her mind, stripping away her defenses, her fear, her guilt. It was all there, exposed, raw, and bleeding. The whispers grew louder. "Face it." She collapsed to her knees in the center of the clearing, her hands digging into the cold, damp earth. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her body trembling uncontrollably. The memory of that night, the night she killed Rachel, played over and over in her mind, sharper now, more vivid than it had ever been. She could still see her best friend's face, the horror in her eyes just before the impact. She had killed her, and she had tried to forget. But the Watcher didn't let her forget. Tears streamed down Emily's face as she looked up at the shadow looming over her. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I'm sorry."